Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our show. I'm Sister Vassa, and today, my beloved viewers, I am so delighted to welcome our distinguished guest, Professor Nadieszda Kizenko, who is Professor of History of the University at Albany. Nadia, could you say hello to our viewers?
Nothing would make me happier than to greet the many fans of Sister Vassa. Hello, everyone.
What was that mug you held up? It says that you don't drink alone.
No, I drink coffee with Sister Vassa.
That's our old mug. Thanks for for drinking from our mug. I'm doing that too. By the way, we
Oh,
do have a new Christmas mug coming out and a 2022 mug. We haven't had new mugs in a long time, but we want to get to our interview with Professor Kizenko, who recently authored a monumental work on the history of confession in imperial Russia. So we're going to be talking about that and certain other things that I find interesting also personally because Professor Kizenko, Nadieszda or Nadia, as we call her. I don't know if everybody knows that Nadieszda in Russian means hope, and we will glean at least some hope for our difficult times from a conversation with her. But let me tell you a little bit about Nadia's background. She, having been born into the family of a Russian Orthodox priest, a ROCOR priest, that is of the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, where, Nadia, in New Jersey?
I was actually born in the Bronx. And
Oh,
then
Bronx.
yes, so in fact, it's one of my points of pride that my passport for place of birth says New York, New York.
Wow, a city girl.
Yes,
New York
exactly.
City girl.
Yes, that's right. And then my parents moved to Syracuse, New York, then to Flint, Michigan, then to Hartford, Connecticut, and then to various points in New Jersey, which is actually not untypical for many ROCOR families and priests.
And then after graduating high school, Nadia went on to study with distinction at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and received her bachelor's degree, magna cum laude, in 1982 in history and literature. After that, she received a master's degree in history from Columbia University in New York. And 2 years later, in 1993, a certificate in Russian and Soviet studies from the Harriman Institute, also in New York. And then in 1995, she completed her PhD at Columbia University in history. And her doctoral dissertation was to be published as an award winning book about St. John of Kronstadt. Do you have that book somewhere nearby, Nadia,
Uh,
about St. John
uh,
of Kronstadt?
Why, yes, I do, funnily enough. Um, Hold on. It
This is an
is,
action packed episode, everybody.
yes, here it is.
That's the award winning book called A Prodigal Saint, Father John of Kronstadt and the Russian People. But most recently, as I've already said, Professor Kizenko authored this groundbreaking book about the history of confession in Imperial Russia. So I'm going to get to my first question now. I want to ask, since you, as a daughter of a priest, as by the way am I, we have that in common, I'm also the daughter of a ROCOR priest. So you had a front row seat, so to say, about the pastoral and also personal life of a Russian Orthodox priest. And then you went on to become a distinguished scholar of Russian Orthodox Church history and also Russian Orthodox pastoral either figures, most prominently St. John of Kronstadt, who was called the pastor of the Russian land, right, by Russian people. But also this topic that you chose most recently to study, confession, does involve very much so the priest. Of course, also the people coming to the priest to unburden themselves. And so, my question to you would be uh, could you share with us how your firsthand experience of the role of the priest, specifically in our ROCOR, the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, how does that compare with your academic discoveries of how that pastoral role was played at a different time and in a different, indeed, setting in imperial Russia.
You know, one of the most interesting things about being raised in a tradition, and especially as the daughter of a cleric, and then going on to studying it, is on the one hand, thinking that one has a certain sort of entree because one knows clerical wit, the clerical way of life. And yet at the same time, one then learns that one simply or can't simply project back into the past. So in effect, when I tell my students that they shouldn't be presentist, that's actually a bit of a warning to me as well. And I think when I think in general about the pastoral role of a ROCOR priest in particular, um, probably the most striking thing compared to the pastoral role of a priest in imperial Russia is scale on the one hand, size and scale, and on the other hand, the relationship that one has to the rest of society and to the state, because those are the areas where you actually see the most difference, I think. Just in terms of scale, in imperial Russia, there were more than 42,000 parishes. The size of the average parish was, I think, like 820 people or 820 families. I even forget which. But in any case, quite large, quite larger than that which the normal that the standard ROCOR priest has to deal with. On the other hand, something that the ROCOR priest has in common with his imperial Russian counterpart is being quite poor by and large. Just as most ROCOR priests that I knew had to have another job, whether it was being the lucky ones were things like engineers and teachers of French. The I don't know if it's more or less typical, but people like my father had Shakespearean jobs besides being priests. And when I say Shakespearean, I mean that they did the kinds of things that occupations that one would have found in Shakespeare. For example, my father worked as a grave digger in the local cemetery in Syracuse, New York. He made candles at various other points. So he did the kinds of things that were evocative of earlier times.
Something our viewers don't know. Tell us how many siblings you have. This was
I
a this
have
was a priest, everybody, with how many children?
I have three sisters and three brothers.
So seven in all. So he had seven children. So
Seven.
he goes and he's being a grave digger. Did your mom work?
You mean did she work outside the house
Well, I
for
mean
money?
outside the house.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
There were times when we lived in Hartford, Connecticut, when some of us were old enough to help look after the children and so on, that my mother would go to work in the evenings after she had fed us. She would go, I think it was actually an insurance company, and work with, bookkeeping or accounting or something like that
Oh,
for 4 hours a night. And this was actually apparently not unusual. It's unusual for ROCOR wives, but it wasn't unusual for housewives in Hartford, to have this sort of evening shift job, which is actually quite fascinating, in fact.
right. Well, you mentioned for ROCOR, priests' wives. I remember my mom going to work at a factory at night,
Right.
and she would sleep. She would sleep in the morning. She had different jobs, but one job she had was all night at a factory that made sewing machines.
Wow.
She had four children. So yeah, that's it is a pretty rough cross, that these priest families bear. All right, but let's let's move forward to talk about how you perceive in your childhood memory and further on as well the pastoral role of your father or other priests also, because
Yeah.
the ROCOR also, as in other churches, I think priest families are friends with other priest families. You sort of grow up surrounded by priests and bishops also. It's like almost like some kind of a soslovia a caste of some sort. All right. So tell us a little bit about your comparison. You already did say, you just didn't describe exactly what you meant by a different relationship to the state and society. So
Yeah,
you're saying in imperial, I can do this.
I see
I
what you
can
mean.
do this. It's an English sentence, an English word. And in imperial Russia, there's one attitude or relationship to the state and to the society at large. And you have said there was a different one, and perhaps is still for a ROCOR priest, but you didn't say that. We're talking about a ROCOR past.
Yeah. I think that one of the most striking differences is that people who grow up in the United States have very little sense for the European model in general. And I want to stress European because, from this point of view, Russia is actually not that exceptional. Most countries in Europe have something approaching a state church or state churches, like established churches. And I know Europeans who come to the United States, and if, let's say, August the 15th isn't an official state holiday, the way that it's not in the United States, and I notice that they're not celebrating, I say to them, isn't this like a really major holiday for you guys? And they say, yeah, but if it's not a state holiday, it doesn't feel like a holiday. And I somehow then at that moment laugh privately and think, when one lives literally on a different calendar, for starters, then everything that one does is slightly different. But the most
Wait,
striking,
I have to explain to our viewers what you mean by living on a different calendar, because the ROCOR is older calendar, which means
yes,
that August 15th happens on August 28th. Even if it were a national holiday, the Dormition of the Theotokos, that it is
yes,
here in Austria, a very Roman Catholic country, right? Uh, then you would get off from school and from work on that feast or on December 25th. But ROCOR celebrates something like Christmas, January 7th, in a country even that does have a day off for December 25th, right? But the children say of a family, of a priest or other faithful in the church, uh, you don't get a day off. You either skip school, right? You don't send the kids to school, and you don't get a day off from work.
that's right. That's right. Um, but from a purely pastoral point of view, though, the priest in Imperial Russia, had to do all sorts of things um, for the good of the czar, for the good of the state. For starters, let's say roughly, I actually did, I tried to do a calculation once, roughly 11% of the sermons that priests gave in late imperial Russia were on czarist topics of one form or another. It could be the anniversary of a coronation or the emperor's birthday and so on, but that's a pretty high number. If Russia was fighting a war with the Ottoman Turks or putting down an uprising in Hungary, this would be alluded to in church and in prayers. And then probably, but for my topic though, for confession, and this is probably the single biggest difference between, if you like, for pastoral practice, is that the priests in Imperial Russia had to keep records that they would send into the religious consistory every year of whether everyone in their parish had gone to confession and communion. This was something that they had to do, and it was something that the state was interested in for a long time, as well as the church. I mean, that both state authorities and church authorities had their own ideas about why encouraging, indeed requiring people to come to confession and communion once a year would make them better subjects as well as better Orthodox Christians.
So
And
it was the law for people to go, all people to have to go
all,
to, I
all,
mean,
all Orthodox Christians,
all
yes.
Orthodox Christians, uh,
Yep.
after the age of what?
After the age of 7. But interestingly enough,
They all
priests
had to go once a year. I just want to make that clear to our viewers. Once a year, they had to go.
yeah. And incidentally, this notion was not alien to the Roman Catholic world either. There was such a thing known as one's Easter duty, and one's Easter duty was the minimum of confession and communion, which and that in the Roman Catholic Church also there was the idea that one should go at least once a year.
The
And
idea, but not the law of the state.
no. Well, although in fact you are in Vienna, Austria, in Salzburg, in Salzburg in Austria, where the bishop actually was the secular authority in the 18th century, and Passau in Germany, there actually were government requirements connected to confession as well. The difference is, funnily enough, is that just as in Europe they started moving away from it, that's exactly when under Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, the Russians started moving toward it. So there's this, if you think of this like a Venn diagram, or a diagram, actually more accurately, a
Wait a
Fahrenheit
minute.
and
You
Celsius.
said Alexei Mihailovich?
Yes, the father of Peter the Great.
Right. So remind us when he was Tsar.
In the 17th century.
Okay, so we're talking 17th century, Alexei
Yes.
Mihailovich. And Alexei Mihailovich is pre-reform or during Niconian reforms? We need our viewers to be informed of this.
Yes, good. I'm glad you asked that question. Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich was, as you might divine from his name, the son of Michael Romanov, the first Romanov emperor. And Alexei Mikhailovich was Tsar at a point when Russia had come out of the time of troubles, was trying to get a grip on things, essentially, to get a grip on people, to get a grip on society after the chaos of the time of troubles. But there was also this idea of, why did the troubles happen? And of course, the standard expression is for our sins, right? And so the interesting thing is that Alexei Mikhailovich starts being genuinely worried, as are his bishops, that there are people out there who are dying without confession and communion. This is actually Alexei's biggest concern, and he keeps sending out missives to Yakutia, to Siberia, saying, we have heard that there are people out there who don't have priests and are dying without repentance, which is a synonym for dying without confession and communion, and saying that this needs to be arranged and everything else. And the most momentous thing that happens is the Great Council of 1666/7, when in response to the reforms of Patriarch Nikon, who has been influenced by Greeks who have instituted reforms. So Nikon thinks that they're being old, but in fact, they're actually quite new. In response to the Ruthenian, aka Ukrainian and Belarusian clerics from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, who've been observing the changes in Roman Catholic confession after the Council of Trent. So essentially, Nikon gets all of these new impulses and thinks, what a good idea if we streamline Russian practice along these lines as well. And so one of the changes that Nikon introduces is to bring in the Trebnik, or the Book of Needs of Petro Mohila, which changes the wording of the confession, giving more power to the priest. But probably the interesting thing for your viewers, listeners, is that that at the Council of 1666, patriarchs from Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, etc., they condemn Nikon for his high-handedness in other respects, but they keep his reforms. And because, and the big issue there is that, just as with the Book of Common Prayer in England, there's a sense that even though there may be nothing wrong with the old forms, they're actually illegal, and you have to use now the new forms. So when so the older forms are simply banned. It's not even, oh, we can have a diversity of practice. No, we don't have a diversity of practice in England. We don't have a diversity of practice in the Roman Catholic Church, and the Russian Orthodox Church doesn't want a diversity of practice in Russia, in Muscovy either. And so the people who resist become known as old believers because they want to do things as one might divine from their name, in the old way. And as a result, now confession also becomes a way of simply determining who is truly Orthodox and who is just trying to pass. So basically, Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich has already been interested in having people come to confession and communion more often. The Ruthenian clerics have provided new rubrics and also even new theology about the benefits of confession and, come early, come often, like voting in Chicago, and introducing terms like the 7 deadly sins, which hadn't really been floating around before, and so on. So with all of this introduced, I think I need to drink my wonder working coffee from Sister Vassa. That now that the people who resist, the old believers, confession, that whether or not they go to confession and communion, this now becomes the litmus test of separating those who are Orthodox and those who are faking it from the point of view of the state church. And so,
okay, wait a minute, but this is already a different motivation. Just to unpack this, it's one thing when Tsar Batyushka, the Tsar, our father, is concerned that we might die without these sacraments. It's a different thing if he wants to separate the sheep from the goats here and see who is ours and who is not reliable. Not
right,
one of us. That's like a
right.
political motivation.
It is, but funnily enough, that motivation is not coming so much from Alexei Mikhailovich. That motivation is coming from Orthodox bishops who want the Tsar to enforce something that they want to do. They are actually more concerned about old belief than the Tsar is. And in fact, one of the most interesting things for me, a recurrent motif, whether it's the 17th century, the 18th century, actually more the 19th century, and the early 20th century, clerics, hierarchs want czars to be more aggressive about policing orthodoxy. And the most interesting thing is that routinely we see, with the exception of people like Peter I and Nicholas I, who are really extraordinary in their hands-on policing and controlling, most of the other rulers, most of the other oberprocurators actually want the church to deal with more of it. And the church is going like, no, we have to go after these schismatics because otherwise too many people will go and join old beliefs. So confession becomes the point at which all of these different agendas meet.
Okay, so all of this is really very fascinating and disturbing at the same time, about bishops being more eager and aggressive than the state authority in an Orthodox church. But let's set aside the role of bishops because it is different from the priests, and let's zero in on the role of priests with regard to the state. I think that it's probably not so direct because more direct is the role of the bishop above them with regard to the state. But I want to stick to our comparison. So you have priests that are the ones that are made to be the watchdogs for people going to confession at the parish level. But then I want you to describe in more detail how is it that they reported? Was it each name was reported, like each faithful person reported by name, went to confession, check? We also haven't discussed the connection between confession and communion, which not all Orthodox take for granted, right? That's a Russian Orthodox thing and wasn't always either, right? But and communion, check. So that would be sent off. But do let us get then to the comparison to how a ROCOR priest would, his relationship with his parishioners and beyond his parish. So you go.
Okay. Well, but by the way, in the blanks that priests had to fill out in their records, in their rospisi, it was the person's name, the person's age, the person's sex, um, whether they had been to confession, whether they had been to communion, and if they had shirked, what was their reason for shirking. And in fact, one of the most novel columns for me was, that someone is 3 years old, and so reason for not going, youth. um, but but the point
Wait,
is, like,
a 3-year-old? So the communion part was reported for the under 7 people?
I didn't actually look at that, but yes, that's right. It would have been, of course, yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
right. So it was later after they reached 7, they're
yeah,
reported also for
yeah.
the
The both,
confession part,
yes,
right?
yeah, exactly. Um,
Youth. They're 3. Do you need another reason? See column 2.
right. Bear in mind, yeah, 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 exactly. Um, I think probably uh, the two big differences are that the ROCOR priests, as far as I know, didn't have to keep any kind of records for that, and certainly they didn't have to send them in to the synod. I
No?
mean that that they did for the state. They did keep the so-called metrические книги, or records of, let's say, marriage, right? Because if you get married,
Baptism also have
baptisms also, yes, 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 right. But
divorces.
yes, well, that's true. But the point is that marriage is something that the state is interested in the United States, because that's also like a legal thing, whereas baptism is not a matter for the state. And so therefore, the beautiful thing about going to confession in a ROCOR parish is that you only you only went when, either when you wanted to go, or when there was a, like, church reason to go, which is to say, during one of the fasts and everything else. There was absolutely no sense that anyone in the outside world had any interest whatsoever in whether or not you went to confession and communion. It just didn't register anywhere outside your parish community. And although hearing confessions well was a quality that was valued by parishioners in Imperial Russia as well, the issue of scale now comes into play, because the average ROCOR parish was relatively small. And so I don't think I have ever seen a ROCOR parish where people would stand in line for 4 or 5 hours waiting to go to confession. All right. Whereas this in Imperial Russia was not so unusual, because everyone wanted to go in the best weeks of the year. As we know, not all weeks of Great Lent are created equal. It's somehow more meaningful to go at the end of the first week of Great Lent, after the reading of the great canon of Andrew of Crete, or to go at the end of the third week of Great Lent when the cross is brought out, or to go on the eve of Great and Holy Thursday, when you can have shared the Eucharist, together with Christ and his disciples in liturgical time and everything else. And so everyone wanted to go in the same weeks, basically, which, it's a classic supply and demand problem, and there was no real way out of it. I mean, that, priests would tear their hair out, and so would bishops, and say, maybe we could tell people that it's okay to go at other weeks. But the
But, Nadia, can I just ask whether those were days off from work as well? I mean, what were wasn't there a time when the first week of Lent, at least in medieval Russia, was not a work week?
Yes. Yeah, yeah. And in fact, one of the most interesting things as time goes by is to watch to see how, as capitalism starts to make encroachments into the Russian Empire, how it becomes harder to persuade employers or landowners who are not Orthodox, to persuade them to give their workers the requisite 3 days off to go to daily services morning and night. And I might point out this was especially charged in the regions where the peasants would have been likely to work for people who weren't Orthodox Christians, whether those people were Polish Catholic landowners, whether they were Jewish employers, whether they were Protestants. I mean, depending on where you were in the empire, there might be different different denominations involved. And so under Nicholas I in particular, the state was much more likely to come to the defense of Orthodox Christians. And it seems like a funny thing, right? That you think of the Russian Empire, you think okay, these are Orthodox Christians, so of course everyone is going to be going, but we forget that it was actually a confessionally diverse empire. And so on the one hand, there are the confessional differences that are real and that the state has to take into account. And the other issue is to what extent are priests and the state authorities itself, to what extent are they more likely to back the privileged over the unprivileged? So for example, it's extremely instructive to see that even before the emancipation of the serfs, from the point of view of the Orthodox Church and therefore of the state, peasants are literally souls, right? I mean, that we might think of Gogol's famous book, Dead Souls, but the point is, the church took them seriously as souls. And if there was a complaint involving confession, like let's say that a serf wanted to complain that their landowner wasn't giving them the time that they needed to do govenia, to do that slot of time that they needed for preparing for confession and communion by daily church attendance and everything else, that they could lodge a complaint, and their complaint would be taken seriously. That was actually quite striking to me.
So what was the requirement? How many days exactly? Before? Just so our viewers understand, there was a requirement for a certain amount of days of going to all the church services leading up to your communion.
Right. The ideal was a week, but in practice, this was in the 19th century. In practice, it came down to 3 full days. And in fact, some of the, in other words, that you had to go to church services morning and night for 3 days before you could then go to confession, and then the next day go to communion. So if the priest had not seen you
in War and Peace, I believe, goes for a whole week, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly. She does govenia for real. And if a priest didn't see you in church, and in fact, it's actually, it could be quite funny to read these cases where where a parishioner says, the priest didn't let me, go to confession, even though I came to church. And the priest says, yeah, of course I didn't let them go to confession because they hadn't been come to church. Who are these people that think that they can just come waltzing in and expect you to confess them then and there without having shown that they were serious?
Right. Now, let's talk about something a little bit more personal about the priest and his pastoral role. In your research, did you find some kind of evidence? I don't know exactly. Did you read any accounts of people mistrusting the priest somehow, mistrusting that whatever they wanted to say at confession would somehow be reported? Because I'm thinking of the following possibility. If it says went to confession, but not to Holy Communion, and maybe, is there a why that has to be explained? Like they didn't get the ticket to go to communion because of something they said? That,
No.
that's a little bit of it seems to me like breaking the seal of confession.
Right. Well, there's 2 separate things. One is that was actually something that old believers would sometimes do, which is to say that they might be willing to go to confession because that was something that the state required. But they drew the line at communion because that was recognizing the official church. So that, in fact, could also be a sign that the person was a schismatic,
Okay, let's
and
leave the schismatic issue, but
right.
let's get to
Yeah,
the issue
yeah,
of simply non-schismatics.
yes, yes,
And
yes.
I don't want to insult anybody who is a schismatic out there, and they don't like to be called that. Now that was insulting right there, right? Sorry to the schismatics. All right. So, um,
Yeah,
that's
no,
what I'm asking is about this business of, okay, the person is not allowed to go to communion because of what they said at confession. Do they have to report what the reason was?
no, 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 no. But the issue that you raise is something that goes back to a requirement that Peter and his sidekick bishop Fiofan Prokopovich put in the supplement to the spiritual regulation of 1722, which is that if someone at confession mm, describes plot, uh, being party to a plot, to treason, to conspiracy, to distributing seditious pamphlets, to fomenting sedition, and they don't repent for it, then the priest is, in theory, required to report it to the state authorities. And this did not happen that often. It was aimed more at the military than anyone else for the obvious reason. These are men with guns, and the 18th century is the great age of literally conspiracies because, after all, Peter has changed the inheritance law, meaning that almost anyone, in theory, can be the next ruler of the Russian Empire. But for the average person, who is nervous or who might not want to go, those reasons are exactly the same as they are in other religious confessions, and that is if you had something that you were in fact incredibly ashamed of, or if you had something really, really bad that you didn't want to admit. I found actually a very touching note written by a thief who had stolen something from the Kievan caves Lavra, and some monks were blamed for it. And he still had the loot, but he was willing to return the loot, and he wanted to confess his sin, but he didn't want to go to jail. And he writes to the archimandrite. He goes, I don't want the monks to be in trouble. I don't even want the loot anymore. I want to confess my sin, and if you swear to me that I won't have to go to prison, I will gladly come and go to confession. And see, that's interesting because that's the kind of thing that wasn't supposed to happen, right? Because that kind of thing, because that that point in the supplement to the spiritual regulation, that was only supposed to refer to conspiracy.
In
And
other words, you're
the,
saying that actually it did happen, that somebody was repenting. The guy is returning his loot. Probably he doesn't know what to do with the trebnik. Maybe he stole the wrong stuff.
no, no,
I don't know what to do.
I think
I
he
got
actually
I,
one.
I thought I got something valuable, but I just got a lot of prayers that I'm not going to read anyway. Um, but so you're saying that it did happen, that people feared that they're, even if they have repented, the thief has returned all of his, I don't know, chotki. And
He hasn't yet done it. He's writing a letter to the archimandrite explaining his dilemma. Right?
no, I
He's saying
get
that
that.
this is,
Yeah,
yeah,
I get that.
but
But
yes,
you're saying
yeah,
it wasn't supposed to happen, that a priest, having heard a confession, would report it, except if it was sedition or
right.
handing out seditious pamphlets. Nowadays, actually, with all of the inagente that are multiplying by the hour in Russia, I wonder how many people would escape were it under that law, back in the latter centuries of the Russian Empire. Who would ever go to confession? Um, I reposted, I reposted, an Ina Gant story. Anyway, foreign agents, referring to everybody in modern day, in the modern day Russian Federation, but we're not going to talk about that today. Um, So you're saying there was an issue of trust, or you're not saying that?
I'm saying that the far bigger issue with trust had nothing to do with the state. I mean that, and here also, by the way, we need to distinguish because the
I
18th
just want
century.
to distinct. I'm sorry. I will. I'm not. I don't want to be rude, but I'm not talking about issues of shame. I want to know if there were issues of trust because of this relationship to the state.
Right.
Was there? Did you find expressions of people? And then I would like to get back to the ROCOR and see how close were and do tend to be priests to the people, you know. But let's get back to Imperial Russia. So, did you find evidence of issues of trust?
Um, yes, among specific groups of the population. Um, in I mean, I should say that the years immediately after Peter's death in 1725, when the supplement to the spiritual regulation has gone into force, and people don't immediately know how to interpret it. I mean, and you actually get things like insurance companies wanting to find out if a guy who's just died, if he has confessed to faking out an insurance claim, and did he confess it on his deathbed? And the priest actually says, no, no. In fact, what he expressed regret for was not having filled out the correct paperwork. And I'm thinking to myself, I somehow very much doubt that anyone on his deathbed will be expressing, saying, if only I filled out my insurance form correctly. Um, but but in like the interesting thing to
But
me is
really, for the priest to say that is, for us, I think, horrifying, actually. Why would he say anything that the person said? I mean, I don't think anybody cares what forms he filled out, but just the thought of the priest saying, no, what he said at confession was, we were taught that,
well,
he would suffer, getting his tongue cut out in hell.
some um, some people did that, but I'm afraid we need to bear in mind that the notion of the seal entered Orthodox theology relatively late, and that in fact, in response to the influence of Roman Catholicism. I mean, the idea of the seal as the seal. I mean, of course, there was an idea that the confession should be private, but the notion of the seal actually came quite late.
I'm simply using a term that
Yes,
is
yes,
understandable, I think, to most of
yes,
our viewers. But certainly Taina Ispovedi,
yes,
the you could
yes,
even call it the mystery, but
yes.
it has a
Mystery,
double
mystery,
meaning
yes,
of
it
the
does.
the, the
Yes,
secret. You know,
yes,
it's
yes.
certainly very talking about it coming from Roman Catholicism is like talking about um, you know somehow canon law coming from Rome. I mean,
Okay,
there are things that are universal to the whole, business of kind of whether it's lawyer client privilege, in that realm. There's a priest vis-a-vis the confessor kind of privilege, if you call it privilege, that's simply understandable. Otherwise, it wouldn't work.
right. But the point is, these these abuses of the seal happened actually before Peter, before Theophan. There's a reason that the Holy Hierarch, the Metropolitan Dmitry of Rostov, has to send out a missive to priests saying, "It has come to my attention that the priests divulge what is said to them at confession for various reasons. We can't have this," and all of that. So the point is, I
Okay,
think,
so that's what I wanted to know. Was there an
yeah,
issue of trust? Were there issues like that? Forget about because of the state. I just want to redirect us a little bit to get back to this comparison of a situation in Imperial Russia and the situation of a ROCOR, our church. You have, uh, a different situation where you're surrounded by non-Orthodox culture, and so my question will be, is there a different approach where you have really, you're not compelled by the surrounding culture, actually, to go to church, to go to confession and communion, if we're talking about adults and not children. Whereas in Imperial Russia, we see that there were reasons that you really had to at least once a year. And the other thing is the pastoral role, the priest's role, is also a little bit different, at least in the sense that in Imperial Russia, many people will know this, the path of becoming a priest usually depended on the kind of family you were born to, especially since Peter the Great, that uh, Peter really turned the Geistlichkeit, the Duchowienstwo, the clergy, into this thing that was inherited, the priestly.
The
Uh,
priestly
so
caste.
a priestly caste, yes. So the freedom involved in the experience in the so-called diaspora, right? Whether you even become a priest, it's just your vocation. But there's not really, we mentioned at the beginning of this video that priest families are quite poor. And so there really is not any advantage from a material level to becoming a priest. And also, you're not in a specific caste necessarily anyway. So Nadia, if you could compare these two situations.
Okay. the I don't think I knew a single ROCOR priest whose father had also been a priest. That most of them came to it on their own for a variety of reasons. But I want to stress that one of the things that I was pushing back against in the book was the assumption that just because something is required, that means that it's automatically suspect or it's automatically bad. I think there's something to be said for, and this is something that Father Alexander Schmemann does very beautifully in his book, Great Lent, is to talk about, and something that Shmylyov talks about in his book, the year of our Lord, right? That there's something to be said for having a support system, having the church bells ringing at certain times of the day. I mean, Henry James said that the big problem with New York City was not hearing enough church bells, right? So I think there's something to be said for having Lenten markets. I think there's something to be said for the mad pealing of the church bells on Easter Day. I think there's something to be said for knowing, and Archbishop Theophan the Recluse says something about this in a very moving survey, a very moving sermon on Great and Holy Thursday. He says, I don't think that there is a single family, he means, of course, Orthodox family, in the Russian Empire where not that hasn't had at least one person go to communion on this day. So we are all here, we're all part of the church, that, and so the Russian land is part of the earthly church on this day, and so on. So and if one reads fiction and so on, one sees that people would try to time their gavenia for the same, to do it in the same weeks. Like, oh, I was going to come visit her, but she said she was doing gavenia. She was doing
For
her
the
annual.
viewers that don't understand the word gavenia, it means the time that you prepare for and go to communion. The word actually means trepidation, like from blagogovenia, right?
Oh,
So
yes,
you're having trepidation before the mysteries for which you're
yeah,
preparing. So
yeah,
whenever Nadia has said your gavenia, it's your confession and communion. The two are paired. You're required in Russian Orthodox tradition to go to confession and then, well, usually on the eve of going to communion. As it happens, sometimes people go immediately before going to communion. All right, sorry, Nadia, you go ahead.
yeah. But in fact, the whole point is not just confession and communion, but to put yourself in the right frame of mind through daily church attendance, through watching your language. That in other words, you train for going to confession and communion. You actually prepare, and it's actually very touching to read accounts of literate people writing examinations of conscience before going to confession and communion. Examining their soul according to the Ten Commandments. Some people actually did this, but so in so in the Russian Empire, at different points, there was a sense that other people were doing it at the same time and that you were in the same boat with a lot of other people. And in the ROCOR, by contrast, people still tended to go during the fasts of the church, but people started also to go more often. Obviously, doing daily services was impossible because most parishes didn't have daily services. It was impossible because the priest had to go to his job. So he couldn't be there serving morning and night. It was possible, let's say, during after the first week of Great Lent, people did. There were services in every parish that I knew in the evening, so that you could somehow reproduce that experience. But the the other thing is how did people prepare for confession and communion? Because in Imperial Russia there was an extraordinary literature of pamphlets that prepared people, for examination of conscience and everything else. And so when people went, they knew what they were doing, right? They weren't amateurs. By this point, they had already been trained. Mothers had trained their kids. Um, and you went with your entire class. If you went to school, children's literature is filled with accounts of the first confession and how momentous it is and how it is in other years. So you understand that confession and communion, that the whole process of Gavenia, of preparing for confession and communion, was also a kind of team building exercise, one would call it now, a kind of social bond. And I think probably what's distinct about confession and communion in the diaspora, in the ROCOR, is that it becomes individual, and it loses that communal aspect. You yourself decide when you feel like going. You might be going through a crisis, and you might think, okay, now would be a good time to go to confession and communion, and so on, without timing it to one of the fasting periods of the church necessarily. And so the social context is different, but also the liturgical context is slightly different, in that although the services of the church have not changed, the services that you would normally go to in preparing for confession and communion are slightly different. And and you can be reasonably sure that the priest will actually have some time to devote to you if that is what you want.
You know what I find interesting? That people don't see the services as the preparation, because there are these long rules, the rule before Holy Communion, that
Mhm.
in and of itself takes a while. The three canons and
Yep.
a Kafist hymn, and then the long list of prayers before Holy Communion. And so sometimes one sees people standing during the Divine Liturgy, finishing reading during, I mean, not just the part right before the distribution of Holy Communion, but during, like, parts that, so people see the preparation not as being the services. So I
Right.
find it very interesting that one could say, well, aren't isn't the Divine Liturgy itself preparation for going to Holy Communion? But people don't see it that way. I do see people standing in line, not for 4 hours, because, people do go very frequently to confession, as far
Mhm.
as I see. In my neck of the woods, I'm not actually talking about the ROCOR. We don't have a ROCOR church here in Vienna, but certainly an influence also of the way, churches
Yes.
do it in Moscow Patriarchate. Confession has become so important that it trumps actually participating in the Divine Liturgy. That is
Yes.
a preparation. It's an ascent. It is a preparation together with the preceding services, but this is
Yes.
the ultimate preparation, the Divine Liturgy itself. But we see it's more important. You'll be seeing lines during Divine Liturgy to go to confession, because that's the preparation. And some of the people in line, it's not so rare to see, will be reading their Fragula not participating in divine liturgy. So
Yeah.
that's an interesting shift, don't you think?
Yes, yes, and not only that, but I want to stress that what we know as the rule before confession and communion is something that actually only appears, as far as I know, in the end of the 17th century, like something called the Учительное известие. Basically, that this rule only enters, it only shows up relatively late. And the interesting thing is that in Russia, the expectation is not that you will read it on your own. The expectation is that you, and it's not read during a service either. You listen to this rule being read while you're standing in church for hours, right? And so basically it's there to fill in the time. But I would posit, if you take away the standing in line for hours, do you still need those texts? I mean,
Right.
because in effect they arrived partly to be filler for when you're standing in church outside the context of a church service. It would
So
not have occurred
we
to anyone to
have had,
read during a
yeah,
service.
but we have had that experience. I don't know if you remember this or if you guys did it, but because as children of a priest, we couldn't go to confession to Our Father. I
Right.
did when I was like 7 and 8, perhaps, but later on, we were told somehow, or our mother told us she didn't go to her husband to confession. Did you guys go to your father to confession?
Only if it was unavoidable.
Okay, so if
But
it's
most of the
unavoidable.
time, no.
But the thing is, I was leading up to that. We would go several times a year up to Jordanville to a
Yes.
monastery. And today we should mention that to people, to the folks at home. A lot of lay people will go to confess and to go to communion to some monastery, where they do find that they can go for several days to services, pogaviet, to have their confession and communion, so they can go because of the regular services, right? And
Yeah. So in
that's
fact,
yeah.
from that point of view, Gavenia, um, go, as practiced by people in ROCOR and as practiced by more than a few people in Russia who also went to monasteries a great deal, or on pilgrimage and everything else, that it is a kind of retreat, to use a term that's used in other languages, that the whole point is that you're stopping real time, or rather you're entering into really real time, you're stopping normal time, and
Right.
you're entering sacred time. And so therefore you actually, you want to be in the vibe, in the atmosphere, and it's much easier to not be distracted and everything else if you're not like racing around going to work and everything else. I'm not saying it's impossible if you are in your daily routine, but for example, I remember my first confession and communion very well, because my mother actually took a train with me from Syracuse, New York to Jordanville, where we went to the services, and it did make a very strong impression on me.
You remember who it was? Was it Atitz Kiprian, Father
Yes, it
Kiprian?
was.
Yeah, for me too. There was this well, he was an iconographer in Jordanville, very well known, and a lot of people would go to confession to him. Nadia, I'm sorry to cut us off, and to our viewers, because this is a very fascinating conversation. But I think that we have a lot to chew on here. And thank you for taking us deeper into our also historical experience of confession, and it gives us a lot to think about how we approach it today. To the viewers at home, let's give a warm round of applause, and let's thank Professor Nadieszda Kizenko for sharing her wealth and depth of knowledge on this topic. We will have her back, hopefully, so that we can continue this fascinating conversation. I want to remind you as well, my friends, before we go, that we do have a new website being rolled out soon. In a week or two, we will have the new website up of coffeewithsistervassa.com. We've been working on it for a while. It's completely been redesigned, and we will have new merchandise for Christmas and the new year, and for Lent of next year. So there's a lot of exciting things going on at Coffee headquarters. And if you would like to join us on weekdays, do check out this link, patreon.com/Sister Vassa. You can have a little bit of accompaniment through the church calendar with this brief audio podcast called Morning Coffee in Your Mornings, if you would like to do that. So join us there. And do not forget, my friends, to get the book of Professor Kizenko. It is available on Amazon.com. Could you hold up the book for us again? See, I have it, I've had it spiral bound and printed out. I don't have my proper copy yet. Good for the souls, everybody. It'll be good for your soul. So get the book on Amazon.com. Do not hesitate to get that. And Nadia, could you please say a few more words to our viewers before we go?
Yes, I would be very happy to. First and foremost, being a Patreon subscriber like me to Sister Vassa is, I assure you, far better for your soul, good for the souls, even than reading this book. Yes, it is absolutely true. It pains me to say it,
We
but
all find that hard to believe, but go on.
and the other thing is that if you do want to buy the book, you can contact me for a 30% off coupon.
Oh, all right, everybody. 30% coupon. Where can we contact you? We're going to put the link. What is your email address? Or if
Um,
you don't want it this
that I can I can actually send you the link, and then maybe when this goes up, we can somehow attach it.
sure. Well, I could put it up here in the editing process, or my
Great,
editing team
great,
will do it.
great, great. That would be the simplest thing.
All right. We'll have the link up here. And any more thoughts, final thoughts to share with us until you come back next time, until her second coming?
Very funny. We are all in it together, and it's a journey. Let us walk along it. Thank you very much for coming today.
All right. Thank you so much. L'union fait la force, as they say. Thank you for tuning in, everyone. Bye now.